A very good evening to distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking time to come to the Art and AI in Conversation panels. The Civic District Alliance presents an inaugural series of panels and sessions introducing the world of art and artificial intelligence. Our session today, How Can Algorithms Be Fair?, brings out the questions about the ideas of fairness and algorithmic justice, like the limitations of machine learning, the development of AI, and how we counter bias. Tonight, we have Assistant Professor Emmanuel Ko from the Singapore University of Technology and Design, Sean Chua, artist and Assistant Professor Malavika Jayaram from the Singapore Management University today to talk about this exciting topic. This panel will also be moderated by me, Kay from MeshMinds. Please note that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the session, so please do enter your questions in the chat. Without further ado, thank you so much for joining me, Emmanuel, Sean and Malavika tonight. I would love to dive in actually by saying we are joined tonight by people who can talk about AI and buildings, AI and performance art maybe related to buildings, and also we want to talk about terminology and things that we might be knowing what we're talking about sometimes. So I'm going to dive in first with Emmanuel. Can you talk to us a little bit about this AIarchitecture.org that you've started? It sounds fascinating. What is the link between AI and architecture? And let us know some of the things that you've been working on.
Right, thanks, Kay. So this AIarchitecture.org is actually quite new. I started, I got the idea sometime late 2020. So I bumped into a few friends in several online conferences and discussions. So the idea is that we sense there is this new critical design aesthetics emerging, and more specifically, an emerging theoretical and technical discourse on AI and architecture at a global scale. And of course, with this COVID-19 pandemic, we also found ourselves teaching in a highly distributed manner, no longer constrained by a particular school of thought or architecture school of thought, and somehow gaining more agency for initiating new forms of engagement outside the traditional confines of schools, academic teaching, professional practice across time and space, in fact. So, in fact, four of us, me, myself, recently moved back to Singapore from Switzerland, and two other friends from Michigan, professors in Michigan, and also another friend, Daniel. He's based in Florida in the USA. So the idea is to somehow have this platform that is really focused on the discussion of AI and architecture in a way that is not constrained by, I mentioned, the school of thought, but this diversity of opinions, of perspective. So in the past, at least in design education, usually it is dominated by elite schools, say those in London or New York, for instance, but never really those from the peripheries. So the idea is to bring what I could call it fairness in that sense, where one provides this space for alternative voices in the distribution of design knowledge and also technical know-how. So but also at the same time, since it is called AIarchitects.org, is to then create an awareness among practicing architects in terms of how one may or may not, should or should not use AI in the AEC industry, which is basically architecture, engineering, and construction industry, where it may not necessarily equate to a capitalistic mode of using AI, say automation or whatsoever. And me being an architect, as an architecture community, we are actually to be blamed in the sense what we build actually represent this sort of capitalistic mode of kind of symbols in physical form. So I think we should move on beyond just creating these forms. We should envision new forms with AI. So therefore, AI, just to sum it up, AI being a critical design material, and hopefully that platform would benefit well, not just architects, but also artists. In fact, it is inspired by the aiartists.org, where there features many famous AI artists like Rifik Anadol or Mario Klingerman. Yeah. Back to
Brilliant.
you,
Thank
Kay.
you. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Thank you, Emmanuel. I think that the application of principles of AI in terms of design of smart buildings is something that is really kind of futuristic in terms of all the ways that we're going to crunch data and maybe design better buildings of the future. And so kind of that neatly kind of segues into something that I found out about recently about Sean's work in terms of I know we've got really used to in Singapore going in and out of all of the buildings with our safe entry and safe exit. And he's actually done a piece on this. So Sean, can you let us know about this piece and that kind of intersection of AI and what you've done?
Thanks so much, Kay. So the work that you brought up, Safe Exit, that was actually a work that was commissioned by Asian Film Archive for this year's State of Motion. So it's presented under Singapore Art Week at Marina 1, the building Marina 1. It was a site-specific interactive multi-sited piece where audiences would be putting on their earphones and listening to this narrative that's unfolding at different checkpoints within the room, the building itself. So this work called Safe Exit was actually a collaboration between myself and Hida Diatma as well as Yining, Taining. And we started with thinking about what is our relationship with data, especially under medical surveillance, right? Like how do we negotiate? What do we expose? And what do we keep private? So I think oftentimes when we think about algorithms and AI, they seem so incredibly disembodied. But especially during last year, and this year as well, during under COVID times, seeing how our bodies are being reconfigured, like through technologies and through algorithms, right? How are our bodies made legible? Something so intimate and embodied is made legible through these systems, as well as how determinations about our well-being is made through some of these algorithms. So actually the line Safe Exit came from, I think it was one of PM Lee's address where he talked about, how do we safely exit circuit breaker. And that was an interesting notion for me because I was thinking a lot about how oftentimes when we're entering these kinds of physical thresholds of buildings, when we have to scan our Trace Together app, right, to sign into, to enter these places, we are also entering the digital databases as well. And what happens to that data? I think that was the kind of critical questions that the work was hoping to unpack and open up. I think I'll have more to share later during our discussion.
Fantastic. What an introduction. That's amazing. I can't, the creative ways that people are already starting to use artificial intelligence is fascinating. And we haven't even, it feels like we haven't even just started to scratch the surface, so there's so much more to unpack. It's really, really exciting. Onto that though, Malavika, I'm going to read out a quote actually that Malavika once said, at a fundamental level, people don't quite understand artificial intelligence. And I'd love you to kind of help us to understand a bit more about what is the terminology. We've already heard a little bit from Emmanuel and a little bit from Sean. What are the types of things that we need to get people used to in terms of the public's general understanding of the vocabulary on this subject?
Hi, thank you, Kay. Here's one of the problems of the internet and of technology. Nothing you say can ever be forgotten. It always comes back to bite you. I think when I said that, what I was really addressing was the fact that we often see a vocabulary mismatch in the way that people talk about algorithms and artificial intelligence. Just here on this panel, we've almost used them as interchangeable words, not things that have their own sort of histories and politics and technical understandings. I think on a technical level, you have different types of technologies that live under this larger umbrella of artificial intelligence. From a legal perspective, you might have different concepts embedded within that. So I think one point I want to make is that artificial intelligence isn't one catch-all phrase that substitutes every other finely grained understanding, but it's often used as a proxy for a whole universe of objects and subjects of understanding, different kinds of areas and spaces of study. I think the other big sort of difference is people use words like artificial intelligence when they want to sexify or capitalize on an idea and make it seem worthy of funding. There's often a sort of joke in this space where if it doesn't work, it's artificial intelligence. If it works, it's just software or statistics or just big data. And I think, again, that's one of the things I wanted to unpack to say, do we use this as something that signals the modern, the futuristic, the inevitable? Do we use it as something that is inscrutable and therefore worth investing in? So I think unpacking what artificial intelligence means in different domains for different practitioners, for different types of expertise, I think that's really important, because otherwise I think we're all speaking at cross purposes when we talk about governing or regulating something like artificial intelligence, which can have so many different meanings to so many different people and in different domains. So I think cutting through this vocabulary mismatch is really, really important, because we might be talking about completely different things.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm actually going to stick with you, Malavika, because I'd love for you to dive, help us dive a bit more into that kind of topic of fairness that you touched upon, in terms of, that is it the big data that discriminates, or is it the people that are using it? So, I always think about AI in terms of, rubbish in, rubbish out. So, we have to remember that there's always, at the moment, certainly still a human being at the center of planning that and creating that algorithm. So how do we, what are some of the things that you've been seeing? I mean, I even saw something about trying out an AI in a court of law, for example, and they didn't have particularly great results so far in terms of, sadly, the AI was still actually having the same prejudices and kind of, spitting out things like, I'm going to judge this situation, and the AI judge says that perhaps people of color should be, yes, they're the ones that are the criminals. They're the ones, because ultimately the big data algorithm says, well, of all of the people, for example, in North America, how many people are people of color who are locked up? Well, it's majority of the Black and American Black population. So does that skew the algorithm? And can you help us to think through that kind of dilemma?
Yeah, sure. I think you're asking the sort of old chestnut of guns don't kill people, people kill people. I think in the AI and algorithmic domain, when we talk about bias, I think there are two sort of very broad categories. There's statistical bias, which, as we all know, is not always a bad thing. It's kind of a fact of statistics. It is biased towards a certain outcome. But there's also a different kind of algorithmic bias when you're talking about algorithms and big data reinforcing and amplifying pre-existing societal biases. So if particular communities, particularly marginalized ones, have particular histories associated with their perception, those could be encoded and amplified when they're digitized and brought into an algorithmic system. So for example, as you mentioned, if particular communities have historically been associated with being criminals, an AI system is not going to sort of negate that. If it's based on data that is biased to start with, which is historical practices of collecting data, of cleaning data, of establishing accuracy, of representation, because data doesn't always represent accurately different demographics. So if particular people are heavily skewed in a data set that collects criminality, that's going to be biasing the outcomes of any algorithm that deploys this. If you're using it for hiring decisions, if you're using it to assess creditworthiness, to decide whether, who is eligible for a loan and who isn't, if the data is biased to start with, the algorithm is only going to amplify that pre-existing bias. with really disparate impact on particular communities. I think there's also this perception that an algorithm embodies something resembling scientific truth, that it's unassailable, it's somehow more accurate than anything that a flawed human could ever come up with. And especially in poor countries where there are histories of corruption, people think, well, nobody's going to bribe a computer, but people can bribe people. Therefore, they trust something that has the sanctity of a machine or the sort of inscrutability of an algorithm, and they think, well, it must somehow be closer to truth than anything a human would be responsible for. But there are people who are urging us to look not at algorithmic truth, but to think of algorithms as opinions, because algorithms optimize for particular outcomes, and that's very much a choice. It's a decision that the creators of algorithms make. For example, are you optimizing for speed? Are you optimizing for accuracy? Are you optimizing for a more diverse workforce? Are you optimizing for a cheap workforce? Right? So depending on what the outcome is, you're going to use particular data sets and you're going to use the algorithm to find certain needles in those haystacks. So algorithms aren't unambiguously good or bad, but it's also about what they're trying to achieve, what data sets they're deployed on, and what the outcome of the system is. So bias is something that can be embedded within systems. It could be implicit biases of the people designing systems that are codified into these systems. And I think the attempts in the law and governance is usually to ask for more transparency and accountability, to ask for explainable AI, which is often we say we don't know what the black box at the middle did. You know, as you were saying, it's garbage in, garbage out. But what's happening in the middle of this black box? What process is converting input into output? And is the problem with the input? Is the problem with the process? Or can we actually look at the output to work backwards and see where that bias might have originated? So there are so many different tools that we're using now to unpack, identify, and govern bias within systems. And I'm happy to talk more about that later.
Super, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Malavika. This concept of the amplification of human bias. Over to Sean. I mean, I think, how do you think, are we able to use human creativity to keep AI in check? What's your take from an artist perspective, or does it kind of conjure up some ideas for future performance art pieces that you might do on this to kind of focus on this amplification of human bias issue that is very real here?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thank you so much, Malavika. I totally agree. I think oftentimes when we talk about AI or algorithms, it almost feels like it's used as a scapegoat. We don't usually hold the humans accountable, right? So in many ways, algorithms or the language of algorithms and AI is almost used as a veil and so I'm thinking about questions of accountability as well, right? How do we hold the people accountable? And oftentimes these technologies are not neutral. I mean, they're never neutral, right? They're designed with a very specific purpose, or it is designed by developed by big tech in a way that is optimized for profit to a certain degree as well. So I think for me, the thing that is oftentimes I think that I'm thinking a lot about is what kind of reality, right? Or what kind of model of reality do these specific algorithms or technologies model in the way in which they're designing? What are they, and whether those models are aspirational, or are they reproducing a certain kind of violence or oppression that's already present in the reality that we are experiencing. I mean, then at this point, responding as someone who is not necessarily embedded in technology, but who is living technology in many ways, right? I think about what it means to retool some of these technologies in a way that's more emancipatory as well. So I think that's why with Safe Exit, that was kind of an experiment where we wanted to play with the very technologies of Bluetooth and proximity sensing technologies to kind of think of a paradigm that's not based on surveillance necessarily, but how do we retool that to think about forms of care that might be extended to one another. I think something that I'm really fascinated about is also thinking about, I think earlier I was talking about what a data body is, right? What kinds of persons are being made legible by these algorithms? And I think about how technology patterns us, how it interpolates us as particular forms of subjects as well. So one thing that I'm experimenting with or exploring a lot about is, how do we kind of recuperate that agency to some extent, again, to not just to kind of accept the terms in which these algorithms position as particular forms of subjects, but to also recognize and understand that the information that's yielded from algorithms are never complete, right? To think about the poetics of incompleteness that acknowledges that the thickness of our lives and our personhoods oftentimes exceed what can be made legible by these tools. And then I think that becomes the political and ethical question there, right? Like what kind of experiences are deliberately rendered illegible also, well, deliberately or not, right? But are somehow made illegible. And whether, to flip that around, whether that kind of illegibility and opacity can also be used strategically by people as a way to think about alternate possibilities. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I love that you kind of brought up this kind of like, well, who do we hold responsible? How much should we hold responsible the creator of that algorithm in the first place, in the search for perhaps a perfect algorithm? You touched on that beautiful phrase, the poetics of incompleteness. And I want to kind of now raise that with Emmanuel in terms of, from a creator of an algorithm point of view, how do you respond to some of the things that Sean has brought up about that poetry of incompleteness, and also how much we should hold people like you, the creators of algorithms, responsible for the outputs, but also touching on what Malavika brought up, the outputs, but also the process and the inputs. So every step of the way. What's your take on this, Emmanuel?
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, actually, talking about, before I go into the main answer, this idea of incompleteness is actually quite interesting. Back in 1982, Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner for economics, actually wrote a book called Models of Bounded Rationality. So the idea is that because humans can never have complete information, they can never be fully, truly rational. And this is actually the case for AI as well, because you can't have unlimited data sets that encompasses every possible information. And this is further complicated by the fact that we are using, kind of limited by digital computation, unlike, say, quantum computing, where we're limited by these state changes, right? Binary state changes. So that's interesting. And then also, before I forget, going back to Malavika, mentioned about this idea of explainable AI is actually extremely important, because what we're seeing now, we've been talking about the problem of biasness, which is in fact related to a specific kind of deep learning models, which typically is dependent on correlations. So in AI speaks or statistics, we talk about correlation is not causation. So just because both observable things, for instance, if you see the classic example will be this. You look at the thermometer and then you see this high temperature reading, and then you look at the sales of ice cream and it's doing very well. So this is correlations, whereas the confounding factor is that it is a sunny day, right? So we can't say that when you see a high temperature, it means it equates to selling lots of ice cream. So that's quite important, and therefore, quite not recently, but with gaining momentum in the sense that there are researchers who looked at this sort of more explainable AI to somehow explain the causation. So, for instance, very famous professor Judea Per, he talked about Bayesian network, which is basically this sort of a different kind of neural networks that allow us to create or test counterfactual situation where you could see the relationship between factor A and B and how they somehow influence one another. And that's important. It kind of make the black box less black in that sense. And we also need to bear in mind that what we're talking about in AI today refers most of the time deep learning models, and these are truly to kind of characterize it is a model that requires big data for small tasks. So, for instance, you train a convolutional neural networks, basically image classification model. You need thousands and millions of images just to figure out if it's a cat or a dog. But now there's this paradigm shift also. I think research in MIT and UCL, they're looking at it. So instead of big data for small tasks, wouldn't it be more natural to have small data and big tasks? So using the somehow going beyond the where and what, in the sense that in a computer vision scenario, you basically have a camera and look at an object and say what it is. Is it a cat or a human face, or where is it in that space? But what is more important, in fact, is the why and the how, which directly address the issue of, well, potentially explainability, and therefore a way to somehow discuss biasness or fairness. And so this is the current kind of state of the art, where researchers see this problem and to somehow embed machine learning models, deep learning models, with fairness by design. And so in that sense, I think as creator of algorithms, we have responsibility, but we also need to know that to what extent are we able to take that responsibility. So with a different deep learning model, you can be as accountable as possible, as responsible as possible. But if that deep learning model doesn't allow that to be embedded, you can't go beyond what you can be responsible with. So this is quite interesting, and I think what will be really useful is in the future, which we look at the whole data science workflow. Typically, you have as computer scientists or programmer basically developing data scientists, basically developing the algorithm, ideally to address biasness or in a way diversify human perspective, is to include social scientists, which is what Google started off wanting to do with the ethical AI team. But we know recently, the two of the employees got kicked out, which is understandable because their role are not that easily quantifiable, measurable scientifically, and could be easily dismissed if you are a very kind of a profit-driven company. Yeah. So yes, we should take responsibility, but we need to know the limits of our ability to take responsibility.
That's right. I mean, I'm actually going to stick with you just for a second, Emmanuel, because I want, because you are related to architecture and Singapore is really kind of trailblazing in the sense of wanting to become a very smart city. And part of this is potentially things like driverless cars, driverless public transport, that kind of stuff. One of the things that was always kind of made me think about the role of AI in our society going forward and how tough it is to plan these algorithms is that dilemma of, for example, an entire busload of people are going along. It is required to, because there is some challenge in the road, it is required to swerve. Now, does it swerve and hit a potential, lady with the pram on the side of the road with her newborn baby, or does it swerve to save all of the people on the bus, etc.? So, that AI is processing such huge amounts of data to try to figure out what does the driverless bus do in this horrible scenario. And then when you swap out things like, well, what if it wasn't a lady with a pram? It was actually, you need to swerve to avoid someone like, I don't know, Barack Obama, or it was Lee Hsien-loong. Do we as humans place more value on that human life? So obviously, yeah, let's I guess all the people on the bus have to die, so it's this endless dilemma. So how is it in relation to things that we see of the smart cities of the future? Can you give us some kind of insight into how is AI going to actually help us to design smart cities of the future? And what do you think about these difficulties in relation to the creators of the algorithms such as that need to pilot driverless buses?
Thanks, Kay. Actually, that question is not only difficult for AI, it's actually difficult for humans, right? To decide, who not to, crash into, for instance. And it brings back the whole issue again about the bounded rationality, the incomplete information that we have, and machine should be equipped with the ability to still make some kind of useful decision. So in terms of these, smart cities is actually an extremely huge topic, right? We talk about sensors and all that, and also the issue of surveillance at the, I'm not sure if you know about those, was it 2 years ago, a year ago? You've got this group of collective artists who basically painted their faces with kind of geometric shapes. So the idea is to kind of disrupt the cameras, the computer vision algorithms, such that they get confused. So as much as we try to make the cities smart, there are these kind of, well, maybe in the art context, I can kind of elaborate a bit more with that example of the collective. There are people trying to kind of stupefy it, right? In a way that the smartness becomes a kind of a stupidity, right? The stupid city, where the original intent, which is basically based on a specific perspective of what a smart city should be, meaning performative, you get all the information that you can from the sensors, and ideally responds accordingly to what's needed based on a particular context. However, unfortunately, the current state of things is slightly, the creators of algorithms are not that critical, unlike a social scientist, about these sort of issues that may arise. Therefore, is not that straightforward a problem, an issue to address, I meant. So if you think about smart city, if you think about fair city, yeah, maybe fair city is quite interesting as a topic itself. So fair city, fair architecture, fair buildings, which essentially means inclusive design. So if you look at, even not talking about AI, for instance, a building, what is an inclusive building? It should be one that, is handicap friendly, that allow anyone to get in there and join the space. In fact, in that sense, I'm actually curious how smart city could potentially means unfair city, because it has this kind of a big brother situation, at least from the public point of view, right? This idea of privacy, this idea of intrusion. just a few weeks ago, or was it 1 week ago, in architecture, I'm trained as an architect, so I'll probably elaborate a bit more. The Pixar Prize winner, this French architect couple, Lacaton and Vassal, their buildings are interesting in the sense that it's so passive that the whole idea of they actually call it fair architecture, which is interesting. The jury in the award ceremony said that their architecture is fair architecture because it is unlike, say, the Alexa, the smart home, where it is so kind of, in some sense, over helpful, that it tries to recommend you specific stuff, right? Trying to be intelligent, but then it's kind of trapped you in that bubble. So in that sense, it's not fair. But in their architecture, is that they provide spaces for negotiation, where you could open up certain space of the balcony to enjoy and do other stuff that you may not have done previously. Therefore, not burdened by the historical data that was kind of locked in by the AI system. So in that sense, I think smart city ought to be AI fair city, which requires social scientists to really be part of the picture.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I'd just love to invite both Sean and Malavika in turn to respond to some of the points raised by Emmanuel in terms of these fair cities, fair buildings. How would an artist's perspective, perhaps from Sean, how would you kind of tackle these types of issues?
I think I just want to give a short comment, right? Just to kind of reorientate this question a little bit. I mean, I know the panel is about, how can algorithms be fair, but I'm curious to kind of reorientate the question to think about how can algorithms be just? I think there's something different about fairness versus just. I mean, this is an ethical question, right? Like we can all be, And what are the competing kinds of fairness that is at play there? I'm curious to hear what Malavika has to say.
Cool. Great. Yeah, Malavika, over to you. What do you think?
I always wish we had humane cities rather than smart cities, because it implies that the intelligence is in the networks and the pipes and the conduits and the tubes and the algorithms, and not in human intelligence and in the collective wisdom of communities. So, and exactly these questions of fairness, justice, equity, I think those are really central to making cities work. People come in search of hopes and dreams. They move from rural to urban areas in the hopes of more of a level playing field. And when cities are hostile towards them, I mean, you have all kinds of hostile design where, you have spikes on benches so that homeless people won't linger on them. You have, rails between them so they can't lie down. So there are all kinds of hostile ways in which cities pick between people as being legitimate or illegitimate, who are welcome and unwelcome. So I think for me, as someone who's very interested in human rights, and as a lawyer who fights for justice, I think these are really the questions that should animate public policy rather than just questions of speed, efficiency, and cost. And we've seen that, right, with something like a pandemic. We've seen that vaccines get distributed to certain countries and not others. We've seen that hospital beds get given to certain people and not others, regardless of the rate at which certain marginalized communities are actually getting sick. Latinx communities, African American communities have less access to medical facilities, even though they're contracting the virus at faster rates. So I think these questions of access and of equality before the law are really, really important. And I think cities are one sort of tapestry in which these questions are deliberated and played on. And I think art is really, really important in this, right? You can tell people about the law till kingdom come, and you're not going to get any hearts and minds. But you show them one Black Mirror episode. I think, an urban myth is that the CEO of Instagram had been shown all kinds of research and studies about how likes on Instagram produce certain outcomes in how people are rated and socially sorted. But he looked at Black Mirror, and that sort of made him want to experiment with how the like button works on Instagram. Similarly, Johnny's son, who's an artist who's now at the Media Lab at MIT, he created this wonderful installation called the Laughing Room, where he'd programmed the algorithm to laugh when it found the conversation in a room particularly humorous. So it was the AI deciding what was funny or not based on all of the data that it had been fed. And it was really interesting. It also had a control room. So the extent to which people under observation change their behavior and exhibit very performative aspects in order to make something laugh or to do something, that's what he was trying to sort of unpack. And I think that kind of an installation, more than any law or policy document you read, makes you think about, in order to laugh, the algorithm, the system has to be listening all the time. And it really makes you wonder if Echo or Alexa, in order to say, turn on the air conditioning or turn the music volume down or up, it has to be listening to every single conversation you're having. And all of that data is being stored. There's another wonderful art installation which a friend, Sarah Newman, at the Berkman Center at Harvard did, which was The Future of Secrets, where you whisper a secret, and every time you do, the computer will print out someone else's secret. So it kind of makes you think about this idea that even the things that you think will be privileged and confidential always have a sort of shelf life or a half-life, and it's only a matter of time before they get released into the world. And I'll just give you one other example, which is Unfit Bits by Surya Matu and others, which is about how Fitbits and other sort of tools are constantly monitoring our health and the way our bodies are codified and represented in different ways. And they came up with all these really cool tools, which is, a pendulum or a drill, which takes your Fitbit and is constantly rotating at a particular velocity to give you steps magically while you're sitting on the couch being a couch potato, Netflixing and chilling, eating potato chips and being unhealthy. So it sort of says, have the healthiest lifestyle you want, regardless of your actual lifestyle. So I think art has a really important role to play in unpacking the ways that algorithms and computerized systems mediate our experience of the world and how we are represented. And to use, what Sean was saying earlier, how are we rendered to the world and to systems that see us and judge us and sort us? Is it a panoptic system that is all about top-down centralized surveillance, or can the city or can art help us to expose the way that artifacts reveal certain assumptions and choices and very, very deliberate politics in the way that they mediate our experience, the way that we're legible or invisible and obscured in front of systems? Are we credit worthy? Are we not? Are we citizens with full body of civil and political rights, or do some people have more rights than others in a sort of very Animal Farm kind of way? So I think the nexus of policy and art is really, really important. And over to you.
Super, thank you. So we're almost at Q&A. So I'll summarize a little bit. We've had a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. We've had, algorithms are simply opinions optimized for certain outcomes. But we must take note of the fact that we can really, really stray into the huge amplification of human bias if we're not careful. We've also looked at, can other algorithms be fair, just, equitable? And then we kind of then rounded back on the idea of maybe not smart cities, but fair cities, fair buildings. And the beautiful phrase from Sean, the poetics of incompleteness in terms of the data that's going into these algorithms. Before we go to the audience questions, and please do, this is your chance to ask the audience, the panel, a question. I want to touch on a little question for a little pop quiz moment. So just raise your hand if you know the answer first, because Malavika talked about these kind of smart devices that are powering our homes now. Suddenly, sometimes you can just be like, it kind of goes on in the background. It's always listening, and it's slightly terrifying. On that, how many times in a year does Google change their algorithm? Is it A, 1,000? Is it B, 600? Is it C, 500? Fastest hand first. Who knows or wants to have a guess?
Well, the lawyer in me wants to say which algorithm. I'm sure Google has more than one.
Okay, Malavika, come on. Is it A, B, or C?
I'm going to take the fifth.
It's C. So it was 500. Google algorithms are changed almost 500 times per year. The search optimization group of Google, named Moz, makes these changes or improvements for Google every time, whenever required. It digs out 500 to 600 improvements every single year, from some of which just literally go unnoticed, unless you keep a right eye on them. These changes in algorithms in recent years have increased actually rapidly because of the growing number of users that make it difficult to maintain proper data. So these algorithms are constantly updated, but who's doing it all? Is it the robot now, or is there still a human being there? It's fascinating things. I've got another question, little pop quiz question. Maybe Sean might know this one. Was art responsible for the early inspiration of machine intelligence? True or false? True or false? Was art
I imagine
inspiration? It's true. Yes, exactly. Well done. That's right. Did everyone know that in 1950, I, Robot was published, a collection of short stories by science fiction writer Isaac Asimov? He was actually one of several science fiction writers who picked up the idea of machine intelligence and imagined its entire future. So I do recommend you should check that out. He is best known for the 3 laws of robotics, actually, designed to stop our creations from turning on us. And he also imagined all sorts of developments that actually seem remarkably prescient. So I think you should check out his work for sure. Let's have a look. Do we have anything from the audience? Oh, yes, here we go. So for Sean, actually, what are some of the most interesting manifestations of AI that you have seen in your research?
Well, I guess it's not really a manifestation of AI per se, but I remembered for one of the work that I was exploring, because I was thinking about medical records, right, and the way in which very intimate stories about care is being shared. So what I did was I did a survey with a bunch of friends, and I decided to feed the responses into a training set, right, into this a neural network that would then churn out other responses based on all these stories of how they were practicing care during COVID times. And there was something that I think it wasn't interesting. Well, it was interesting in the sense that it surprised me a lot. How uncanny it was. On one hand, you see narratives, a kind of substructure of the kind of grammar in which this group of people were talking about the language of care, but there was something that was almost creepy or violent almost, because it felt like it was going into a very intimate space that somehow and yet so I guess it's an uncanny territory, right, where it feels like it feels like it's yours, but somehow it got turned into something that's completely alien.
Super, thank you so much. I've got another one, this one for Emmanuel this time. Where do you think Singapore is going in terms of AI? Very broad question.
Yeah, it is really broad, actually. Where is this going? Definitely, Singapore is primed to do this sort of AI research because it has the infrastructure. For instance, a few weeks ago, I interviewed a few postdoc applicants to my lab, and one of the reasons was that it has the infrastructure. It's not possible to do certain AI projects without this kind of a setting. So going back to your question, where AI is heading in Singapore, you're saying, no? If you look at many of the research, well, because I applied for them, therefore I know it. The open call for the AI Singapore application, multi-million projects, they are interested in AI and design because this is the next frontier, right? And design is kind of linked to creativity, almost, by nature. However, you may consider design from an engineering design point of view or fashion design point of view, it has this underlying necessary ingredient, which is creativity. So therefore, I think my hunch is that there is this understanding of design playing that kind of a role to kind of advance the AI research. If you talk about like what Sean was sharing just now, I mean, it's amazing. You have these generative models that produce this uncanny human-like thing, and the same thing for for design. If you think about it, if you could design buildings in a similar way or the entire city, it is actually amazing and also scary. Yeah.
Absolutely right. Whether the robots are coming or the robots are already here. I've got another question to everyone, actually, so I'd love to hear from you all. Oh, sorry, Malavika, did you have something to say in relation to that? Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add on, the future of Singapore and AI. I think on the legal front as well, Singapore is really trying to be a hub for governing AI. The Personal Data Protection Commission has come up with a model AI governance framework, and they've also got a version 2, which has a lot of use cases with actual industry partners. So I think Singapore also is very much aiming at occupying a large space in the governance landscape and helping to create norms and governance frameworks that can help regulate and create these sort of sandboxes where people can try out different regulatory models. So I think that's also part of the future of Singapore and AI, not just the creating of the tech, but also the regulating of the tech.
Super, thank you. I'm actually going to stay with you, Malavika, because I actually wanted to ask you this question earlier in relation to what Emmanuel brought up, this fair cities point. So this question is related to, when you guys were mentioning about fair cities earlier, what do you think of the way that China is actually one of the current superpowers in AI and is using AI to track its citizens and people? Malavika, what do you think first? But this is for everyone, please.
I think one of the sort of assumptions often is that China is able to make these huge strides for two reasons. They have access to a quantum of data that would simply be unimaginable in other countries. They're able to gather and collect it without necessarily seeking consent. And given the population size, that's an enormous database that they have to work with. So they're able to actually test algorithms and different types of artificial intelligence systems on an extremely large database. So that's sort of one element people often attribute to its success. The other thing is, I think this is, you take it with a pinch of salt, but people complain that there are a lot of patents given for AI applications in China that would have been thrown out in patent courts in many other jurisdictions. So it's extremely easy to protect it from an intellectual property perspective. But I think also in terms of social norms, there is this idea that the balancing act or the trade-off that you make about individual freedom versus collective ideas of security or surveillance are perhaps skewed more towards collective, and they'll bring in Confucian ideas to explain why this has public buy-in. But I think we're beginning to see the cracks when you look at things like facial recognition that are disproportionately affecting minority populations, ethnic Muslim populations in the Uyghur area, in Xinjiang, in other places. So I think the social credit system and facial recognition are often used as sort of two really big examples of Big Brother. But I think one thing we have to question is something like the social credit system in China also has enormous public support. And if you think of the history in a country that doesn't have ways of gathering creditworthy information to allocate risk, something like social media being repurposed to fill that regulatory gap is something that seems sensible to a lot of people. And it's not limited to China, it's India, it's a lot of Africa, where in the absence of other kinds of data about people, social information that's given for playful purposes is being repurposed to making really critical decisions about eligibility for welfare, for benefits, for loans, for all kinds of things that it was never meant to. For example, if you charge your phone often, you're deemed more responsible. If you play a lot of video games, you're deemed irresponsible. And I think these are very flat assumptions and stereotypes. And I think all the people who critique China, on one hand, are very nervous that this could come to a country near them, but they're also extremely envious that China is able to make these strides, whereas other more democratic countries are not able to do it. So I think China is a very, very difficult and complex equation, and it's not all terrible and it's not all Black Mirror.
Super, thank you. Sean, what do you think about this craziness of the social credit system in China? What's your take on it all?
I mean, to be honest, I can't make a very clear assessment, right? Because I think a lot of it is also based on I guess my awareness of it is quite superficial. But I think a part of me also believes that it's not so. Okay, let me put it this way. I think oftentimes in the conversation around China in the field of science and technology, I think it's sometimes laced with a degree of racism as well. I noticed there's usually a tendency to other or radicalize how weird or how crazy or how absurd this strange dystopia is, right? There's this kind of techno-orientalism that sometimes lurk in some of these conversations. So I think like what Malavika said, it's not about trying to make some kind of huge claim, again, having no context within that space, but except to say that actually it's not so dissimilar from a lot of things that are already, we see the infrastructures for many of these technologies and ways in which technology is used to manage people, right, in civilizations beyond China.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a quagmire. It's just kind of, the thoughts around it are almost like wading through mud. Where do you start? Where do you stop? It's crazy. Emmanuel, what do you think about this, the China perspective and the social credit system and the fairness of facial algorithms?
Yeah, actually have a collaboration with Zhejiang University on some AI project, and they are based on basically next to the Alibaba AI research area. So I think they are really moving very fast, and they do have a lot more research compared to Singapore, for instance. But there has been kind of discussion that as much as they do have the infrastructure, they do have the kind of computing power, of course, and also the kind of social structure to make this happen. We know that for funding research in AI, there's always some kind of agenda behind it, like a governmental agenda, or in general, more so in their case. So there may be, in terms of research quality, I'm not saying which is better, outside China, within China. I'm just saying that they have a specific, more kind of civic agenda or direction in their research, and that may be one possible factor that may slow them down in the long run. But this is just speculation. So again, as much as the current social construct or culture allow them to move really quickly, but it also may create certain kind of a stumbling block for it to progress. Yeah, and there's so many books about them, taking over in 5 years, taken over from the US. Now that with the COVID, it's even quicker.
Super, thank you. And we are almost at the hour. So I just want to say that thank you so much to our amazing panelists. We've covered all sorts of things. And we have to remember that as we navigate the poetics of incompleteness of the data that we have, we need to make sure that we have our algorithms that are fair, just and equitable for all. Before we head off, we would very much like to take a photo with you all, actually. So I believe that we're going to all put on our video screens and take a photo together. I'm sorry, we have actually obviously run out of time. We did have some more questions, but we can't take them all, sorry. Are we going to have a photo? Great, okay. Cool, excellent. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much to our speakers from the panel. How can algorithms be fair? And we do hope it's been a fruitful session for all of you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So if you missed the live panel, don't worry. Recordings of this panel will be uploaded onto our website as shown on our screen. Keep a lookout for them and feel free to share them after this event. You can also get further updates at Civic District SG on Facebook and Instagram. However, we hope that you'll be able to spend a bit of time, don't go yet, to answer our post-panel survey before you leave. You may access the survey via this little QR code that you see on the screen. We really, really would appreciate your feedback on this panel. We do hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, thank you so much. A special thanks to the Civic District Alliance for this event. And thank you all for joining us and for your cooperation and support. Have a brilliant evening ahead. Thank you.